appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely.
That light is blurry.
Yeah, those are bright. Those are bright lights. This is not nearly. Oh, we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. If you're standing in the back, please move in. There's several seats up here in the front. We're going to be closing the back doors very shortly. All right. There's several seats up here. There are seats up here, sir? There are several seats up here in the front. All right, great. Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon to the 7th Annual AWS Public Sector Summit. Thank you for coming here today and being part of the AWS Security, Governance, and Compliance session. Every year we have a special group to talk about how they're meeting the security requirements that is related to their regimes. And we invite our customers who are using AWS today and our solution architects to provide best practices and share their stories with you on how to start moving to AWS and how to address these challenges. So today we have our guest panels, and it's going to be moderated by Brad Dispenza, Amazon Web Services Senior Solution Architect. And we have our guest speakers here, and I'd like to have them each introduce themselves and their organization and what they're doing to AWS today. So we're going to start off from the far end right here.
My name is Bassam Amrou. I represent the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office in the state of California, in Sacramento. And how we're using the AWS, it's basically one of the questions is basically CJIS compliance. And we're going to talk about that in detail. We're leveraging AWS basically for the various workload. And then in two phases. Phase one is the non-CJIS component for data. And the phase two of this is awaiting the CAC, which is the Class Advisory Committee approval, will contain then the remainder of the workloads. And by doing that, eventually the organization will be completely in AWS.
All right, thank you, Bassam.
And my name's Jason Fischel. I'm the VP of Engineering at Remind, and we're an ed tech company, and I'm going to be talking to you about FERPA and maybe to some extent COPPA as well, and how we do that in the cloud.
Thank you, Jason.
My name is Scotty Ellis. I'm here from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. I am here to talk to you about HIPAA compliance for healthcare sector and how we make that happen with AWS.
Great. So enjoy today's panel discussion. Brad?
Thank you very much. So compliance in the cloud is something that a lot of customers are interested in doing. There's a lot of unique opportunities for workloads that are sensitive in nature that have historically outgrown the capabilities of a traditional architecture. And in the realm of compliance, AWS and the cloud offers some really powerful tools around security, compliance, monitoring, and auditing. And what we really want to give folks a sense of today is a little bit about how three very important compliance packages operate within the scope of AWS, because each three of these represents a very major portion of customers that are running sensitive workloads in the AWS environment. And we've heard a lot of customers that want to move workloads into the AWS environment, but still don't quite understand how to do that. And through the course of this discussion, we're going to try and check off some of those questions that we hear frequently from some of our customers, as well as an opportunity for you to hear directly from great customers about how they're actually implementing this. So before we actually dive into the Q&A section, I want to give each participant a moment to kind of give you a little background about themselves and their organization, and a little bit about their workload that they're running on AWS, to kind of give you a little bit of scope and understanding of where their mindset comes from. Because these are three very distinct pillars or different classes of workloads that speak to very different populations. But at the same time, they have a lot of overlapping components among them. And I think you'll see that as the session moves. So, Scotty, please.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, let's check it out. So sure, HIPAA compliance in AWS. So a lot of people, at least in Houston, which is part of the Texas Medical Center, the group that I'm with, which is, I think, one of the largest medical centers in the world, it's basically a big question about how to get this stuff done to basically better serve patients. So one of the systems we run, for example, is Passport for Care, and it's a survivorship portal initiative. It's to help people, basically, let's say you get cancer kind of early in life, you get treated, then you have late effects from the treatment. How do you move on when basically you might see a different doctor who doesn't have oncology experience, so they don't know about cancer. Can basically we use technology to better inform future physicians who might see them, about what late effects they may see. So I just want to give you that bit of overview about kind of clients that we serve, so patients or former patients or doctors, and then the key points we use to achieve HIPAA compliance. So basically, if you wanted to do what we did, which is move your data into AWS and have your system still be considered secure and be secure, you'd want to follow key points like this. So basically, you'd want to sign a BAA with Amazon. They will do it with you. It does come with some specific requirements. If you have other questions, obviously, I think we'll have time afterwards. So feel free to ask me a bit. I'll be here for a little while afterwards. You basically set up separate infrastructure that you may have elsewhere in Amazon. So maybe you already run other not related websites or something like that. You want to establish a completely separate Amazon logon, completely separate everything, different VPC, all that. Part of your agreement, at least part of our agreement, and I assume of your agreement if you sign one, is that you have to use dedicated instances, which have a much higher cost than the shared infrastructure you may already be running or may consider running in Amazon. And you also need to actually pay the per region cost of $2 an hour if you use EC2. Maybe there's other reasons that you'd pay the per region cost, I'm not sure, but that's why we pay it, is because obviously we use EC2. So that is expensive for many smaller providers. For a big provider like Baylor, it's not the biggest deal. But for some people, that'd be almost a deal breaker, depending on what kind of model you had with your customer base. So do keep that in mind. Meaning if you launch even one server in EC2, that means you're going to be paying $2 an hour on top of your server cost in that region. Okay, otherwise, just as a best practice, I'd really recommend with HIPAA, beyond the BAA and other security controls you'd work on just within your team, to follow best practices as the federal government has already defined them. This is a great audience for this kind of discussion. Hopefully you saw the FedRAMP talks before. I'd really recommend trying to follow FISMA and FedRAMP at the moderate level and mapping it. Even if you never get an ATO, which you probably won't, an authority to operate, you want to map your practices for the healthcare system against that FedRAMP documentation, because it will help you a lot operationally. And I think that's about it for me.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Scotty. And then just a point for folks. So the discussion around dedicated tenancy as part of the Business Associates Agreement does come, as we were saying, with a per hour fee. But just as a point there, it's to the account and to the region. So for every EC2 instance that you spin up, it doesn't come with an associated on-demand hourly rate as well. It's to the region.
All right, so I want to talk to you guys all about something that affects everyone in the room, and that's education. You might know that 8,300, or you might not know that 8,300 students drop out of school every day in this country. And Remind exists to connect teachers, parents, and students to enable safe communication between them, and it's working. We have over 35 million students, teachers, and parents using Remind. We're probably the biggest company you've never heard of operating in this country. And we have active teachers in 50% of the K-12 schools in the US as well, 75% of the districts. So our approach is to basically be teacher obsessed. We focus, when we started the company, the founders decided that they didn't want to be an enterprise product that sold directly into schools, but rather we focused on teachers, and we built a product that could serve them directly and serve students and parents directly as well. We also deliver our service over SMS, which allows us, over SMS and mobile apps, which allows us to reach even students that don't have smartphones or don't have computers at home. And we provide communication that tries to enable as much safety as possible, because we're talking about something that is providing communication services from teachers to children. So our challenge is getting ready for the back to school, which is coming up in just another month. In the peak of our back to school season last year, we were adding 400,000 new users every day. It's a huge scale, and one that Amazon really helps us with. We run entirely in the cloud, and that allows us to scale up pretty quickly. We went from 50 million to 200 million messages per month in the middle of so in this past school year. This year we'll probably go up to 600 million or 800 million messages a month. So the numbers grow very, very fast, and we see the growth happen in a matter of weeks in the period of August when kids start going back to school. This is something that provides interesting scale challenges, but it also provides us with interesting challenges around how do we secure the information, the PII, of children and of the rest of our users. So when we started at the company, we just had a handful of services. We were using Redshift, S3, and CloudFront. As of last year, we're using all of these services. We're actually using quite a few other ones. Amazon is a great partner for us in providing, in helping us address our regulatory requirements and also our scale requirements as we grow really fast. This is just a quick slide showing what our architecture is, and I'll talk more as we go into the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks. Criminal Justice Information Services. Actually, it would be interesting to find out a linkage between the 8,300 people that drop out a day and how many of those will end up being record criminal justice. If anything, that would be my gut feeling, but I have a data model for that, right? It would be that actually it would show a correlation that would, encourage us to spend more on education. Not that we want to spend on enforcement, but we'd like to have, everybody have their fair share. Okay, what is CJIS? For most of you, it's when I got into law enforcement a few years ago, I thought it was a bureaucratic red tape that I had to deal with, like most people initially imagine. But I thought, let me fill out whatever form is needed, whatever needs to be done, so that way I can pass that audit and we can resume business. Well, that was very naive, because obviously one of the things I did not realize that law enforcement in general are in law enforcement business, they're not in the IT business. They're not in the information security business. And so what the feds did, or the FBI did, they came out with this model. I call it an umbrella that we call CJIS. So it's like a minimal set of requirements that you have to adhere to in order to be compliant, in order to use this. So I call it trust but verify. It really is nothing but a data set that's set at a minimum. You have to implement it if you want to get to criminal justice information. So what does that mean if you're a user or human being, I also need to validate that, yeah, this person is running, so if I'm running somebody, I'm running it because there's a reason I need to know. So CJIS gives you a lot of steps what you need to do. So in case I'm looking for somebody on a go out the date, probably I don't want to be using the CJIS system to validate that she's okay for me to go out with. That's be a violation, and at least amount of that. So what basically security requirement is an umbrella associated with from the beginning to the end of the data journey. So as you create records, all the way to destroy records, the CJIS umbrella is really over this data processing life cycle, if you would. So, and CJIS is there, it's not just because of the cloud. And what's basically CJIS, for the cloud, or certification or validation, if you would, is simply taking the CJIS requirements. So, this process continues to be as is. This business rules continue to drive us. And as you implement the cloud or whatever technologies, that umbrella remains as is. So if I am basically creating a record, whether I create it in paper, the controls, if you would, remain the same if I create it in paper or if I put it in the cloud. So the controls are the same. People who need to run it have to be background, whether you do it in paper, whether you do it in etching in the stone, or you do smoke signals, or you put it in the cloud, they remain the same. So the technologies really don't change the definition of the core of CJIS. So what the technology simply does is empower us to do things faster, cheaper, and better. And so the question is going to be, what are we doing, or what can we do in the cloud? And one of the initial business problems, not the technological problems, that one you have to deal with is, as everybody's seen, Ferguson and what have you, this whole tsunami of body cam technology is one of the drivers to start looking at, okay, how can it be flexible? How can it be nimble? How can it grow elastically with my business needs? So if I need 1 petabyte of data in 5 years, it would be foolish for me to go buy it today and wait to fill it up in 5 years. Because today, I pay X. At the end of the year, I can get 2X of capacity at half the price I pay today. So it's like diminishing returns over time. So if you really invest in the CapEx model, that is not really a good way to go about to grow, to meet your business needs and business requirements. So what the cloud offers in AWS, and here we're talking about, is the ability to have that flexibility, that elastic model. So I call it the perfect suit, that you gain weight. I'm not talking spandex here because it should be illegal. So it stretches and shrink, based on your, growth factor. So that's what's basically what we're looking at CJIS. So it's an overall umbrella. So when you create records, who view them? So when somebody views the records today, we have to have an absolute login and auditing. So is this person violating the trust that we did? Is this being, could be tracked, traced, see who did it, when, and how, and why? A modification. If somebody modified the record, there absolutely better be a very good reason why it's modified. So, and those tracking are there also, these transmission. So if we transmit a record, so you do it by mail, via fax, via email, or smoke signals, or you want to do in Morse code, however you want to transmit it, the transmission has to be secured, encrypted, and validated. And dissemination, so a need to know. So if I have a rap sheet of an individual, I can't just go around, telling my spouse or my friend, well, look what my next door neighbor did. That'd be a violation. The dissemination of information has to be also controlled. The storage, we talk about storage in AWS as well. It's the elastic, the capacity that will grow with your needs. And finally, your destruction and whatever your retention policy is and what is not. And I don't know if I want to continue talking or just give the floor to folks to talk some more here.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into some of these points. So I think everyone can kind of see that in some ways, again, there's a lot of overlap. For HIPAA, there's questions around not only protecting my clinicians to know what they've accessed and protecting my patients to know that I have a right to know that a clinician isn't sort of rummaging through my personal information, and very much so for the FERPA case, right? So when students have that right to know that people are not inappropriately using that data, just as in with CJIS, we don't want folks inappropriately accessing data. But across the board, it all speaks to similar boundaries and constraints. And what I want to start the discussion with is, in all three cases, and really much so for you, Jason, because it's the oldest package, are compliance programs keeping up with the pace of innovation, and specifically around workloads that are more cloud-centric in nature? So Scotty, let's start with you.
Sure. I think that's a really great question. Actually, that is what brought me, my department, and thus that chunk of Baylor College of Medicine to Amazon, was that we needed to basically innovate more swiftly to sort of stick with what people wanted to see in terms of websites and the usage of these various sort of clinical and non-clinical tools. And the only provider really that we found, and I investigated quite a few, that met our compliance requirements was Amazon. So I'd say that in short, it's always a process. You talk to the compliance team, you deal with the people in your applications team, architecting things appropriately, auditing trails and so on. And then you already get to leverage the really awesome pre-existing controls that Amazon will give you if you manage to use the services and, of course, implement them correctly.
Great. Jason?
So FERPA is an interesting one because it was passed in the 70s, way before the cloud existed. And so it's been somewhat complex. And one of the complexities around FERPA for a company like us, a provider in the cloud, is that FERPA applies to schools and districts. It doesn't apply directly to us. So it sort of transitively does. And there's a lot of confusion around what it means to a company like us. So, and you can see some of the confusion is manifesting itself as states passing laws like in California, so HIPAA. This is both, the laws are the laws are evolving in the states. That probably means that there's going to be push to modernize it at the federal level. But this also creates some uncertainty for companies like us because we don't know if they understand our use cases well enough to be able to properly regulate it. So it's definitely a concern. We're like a lot of the other ed tech companies out there. We're working closely with a lot of the districts to try to figure out what it means for everybody.
Makes sense.
In terms of keeping up with technologies, government is a challenge in general. It's like this big ship you want to take to sea. In order for you to make a U-turn, you got to go several miles before you could turn around and come back. But when it comes back, it better not get in the way, right? So the issue is keeping up with this is a challenge in the sense that, especially with CJIS, because CJIS is a delegated responsibility and shared responsibility somehow. So the feds, the FBI, they could set the policy, and like the last audit we went through is actually keeping up with some of the changes. But as these changes that are set at the federal level, now they're pushed down to the state. Now some states have different nuances. So just because you are CJIS compliant at the federal level doesn't automatically make you compliant at every state level. And even at different states, for some reason, we look at security 50 different ways. And so at the state level, some are say, you know what, it's good enough for the FBI, it's good enough for me, pass through. Some say, no, we have more security than the FBI. I'd like to see those differences sometimes, but and then we can maybe put some more definitions. And some say, you know what, no, I don't care. I'm out of this business. It's between you and them, and I just don't want to be the intermediary. So that creates a little bit of conflict. And so you have, law enforcement agencies throughout the nation at a different level. So if somebody is going to be more an adopter of the technology, may face different challenges depending where you're at. So different states, things are easier than others, and some places are more complicated. And so in order to leverage the cloud, for example, the state of California, to go and to do law enforcement in the cloud, you had to wait till the Department of Justice in the state of California deem it okay, and then you got to go through an application process. And that application is the exception, basically you got to go through the process to be authorized to be able to do that. So there's a delay, obviously, and some might say, well, it's good not to be on the cutting edge. I mean, clouds have been around for some time. So it's a challenge, But eventually, when it gets there, And when government in general adopts it, it makes it more mainstream, makes it more economical, and it becomes much more affordable for everybody.
So in that context, when we talk about sort of different interpretations and concerns around how things should fully sort of metastasize, as it were, as a developing product, Jason, you're fortunate to be in the Bay Area and the tech hub where everything happens at the speed of light, if not faster. But for some organizations, especially I imagine a lot of folks in our audience today, there are still folks internally that have resistance. And for organizations that were not born in the cloud, I'm curious if you can share some information about what that before and after looked like when you first started moving those critical compliance workloads to the cloud and how your teams have evolved.
Yeah, I can totally take a stab at that. So I certainly met with resistance at BCM while first trying to step into it, which now is probably about, 4.5 years ago, something like that. The way that we waded into it was I did a proof of concept with part of Baylor, with part of the networking group, to show that we could get and maintain site-to-site VPN tunnels between the region that we were going to build out and use in Amazon and the actual infrastructure locally in Baylor, so to make basically a hybrid cloud kind of setup. And so once we proved that that worked, and eventually we made it work pretty much flawlessly, but that took a while, that sort of opened up the gates more. Meanwhile, we were already running the same system I showed you before in a completely different infrastructure with a different provider. And essentially, right around that time, Amazon started signing BAAs, because a while before that, like kind of right after we were starting to wade into the waters, they weren't even signing BAAs. So at least in the healthcare world, it's kind of like, that's like, well, I don't even know if I want to do anything right with this provider. But with that taken care of, and again, with clear and just kind of relatively constant communication with Amazon, we knew that could be done, we did it, and things have been working smoothly since.
Great.
I can let you.
No, please do.
Well, I mean, what I can say is, being a tech startup in the Bay Area, we didn't have any resistance to moving to the cloud. We were created in the cloud.
There's
we
so
might
much
have
out there.
we have resistance to data centers. If anything, we maybe had to create a little bit more fear of the cloud than the opposite. But probably where we see issues is with districts. The districts have, and honestly, we don't see that much of it now. I think our industry has moved a fair bit in the last 3-4 years, and so we've had success operating in that world, and because we started out operating directly with teachers, and only now we're starting to engage with districts, I think they're ready for it. And I don't know if you guys have seen the same thing, but just the last few years, it's a big shift.
When they introduced the concept of cloud 5 years ago, it was a 4-letter word in my industry, and it was like, "Are you crazy? This is a fade. This is insecure. People are going to hack you. The data is going to be exposed. You don't want to stick your neck out there, etc." I said, "Well, behold the turtle. It only moves when it sticks its neck out, right?" And based on that, I said, "You know what? In order to do that, it's going to be an evolution, because there's 2 ways to do this. A revolution usually ends up with a bloodshed. In this case, it would have been mine, right? Or you do an evolution in which you try to bring the organization kicking and screaming, into that direction." So the adoption was basically 2 layers. Layer 1 at a policy level, because you have to be CJIS compliant. So, it was not available at the time. So, let's do what we can do with the commercial, to try to model, to, do an R&D, look at disaster recovery concept for non-CJIS, component of the data. So that was, one way to kind of look at it. So we started looking at this and sampling some backup, recovery, et cetera. The challenge was also internally within the IT staffing. So I couldn't get the Bay Area resources because I couldn't afford them. So the concept is you have to do with what you have with the resources. I had good staffing, so I had to say, look, you evolve or you dissolve. This is the train, and basically you got on it, or basically you're gonna miss the opportunity. The infrastructure staff had a challenge with that, because initially they thought that going to the cloud is going to put them out of work. which is really not the case. So just not putting out in work is basically changing your job, retooling you, is making you more, adaptable, making you, et cetera, et cetera. The development resources were much more excited. So I don't have to deal with the infrastructure people anymore. I can click and build my machines. So, well, no, it's not a free-for-all. There's money you have to control. So it's a balancing between those two things. So as you start building your resources and your skill set internally, and you build awareness and advocate for it on the policy side, then you also look at your ecosystem and see who are your partners and how you can exchange data and exchange data with them. So it was a very interesting challenge as well, because you have to do education, and as it's becoming more and more mainstream, resistance start becoming slower. And then once you get CJIS certified, well, okay, now somebody else can take the blame because they certified it. So it became easier, on the implementation side. But what I looked at basically for the cloud is, every CIO had gone through an evolution. So IT organization went from a data processing, environment to then they call themselves information technologies. Now we're information. Well, but information these days is not enough, because you got to go from information to intelligence. And the CIO, if he does not or she does not become the chief intelligence officer, then the CIO stands for career is over. Because at the end of the day, you're not selling gadgets, you're not selling tools, you're selling value. And the value is not data and information, because anybody can Google stuff. It's about now making intelligence. So are you at the helm at your organization and looking at its business drivers? Are you looking at what impacts that organization in the overall, in the macro level as well as the micro? And how can you interact? Because you're all, no matter where you are, what industry, you have interdependencies. And are you aware of the interdependencies? And how can you leverage this flexibility, this utility model, to allow you to deliver as needed and when needed? So that elastic capacity or computing power now is at your fingertip, so that way you don't have to focus on the beast, what I call infrastructure, and you can keep feeding the beast and becomes a distraction. Now you gotta use and leverage technology to focus on intelligence, so that way you can focus on directing the organization and giving it the tools and the information and intelligence to go in the right direction. So the cloud is becoming more of an empowering tool to go in that direction, but also it has its own little challenges as well.
So an interesting topic that was brought up sort of across the board was that, in the case of Baylor, it started off as a simple POC, and in the case of DOJ and the folks in California, it was more an evolutionary process. And even in the sort of high-tech Bay Area, there's still not absolute trust in everything that's cloud. So as part of that, as you brought your compliance workloads into AWS, did you have an opportunity to leverage any of the solutions architecture or professional services in AWS? And did that help accelerate or provide clarity for some of those workloads?
Good question. Well, I suppose the answer to that is, in my particular case, a bit minimally, but a bit, in that we did talk with quite a few helpful Amazon people. We didn't engage someone as like a technical account manager or something like that, which is, for my department, was considered quite expensive. I mean, it's like 15 grand a month, something like that.
Yeah, for the enterprise services.
Yeah. So we opted for the much cheaper, lower rung, the business services, which basically lets you call in, whenever you're having issues. We've used that many times. It's been incredibly helpful. But the solutions architects have been great in providing us occasionally, when we ask, roadmap information about when certain features of different Amazon products might be released, sort of what those timelines look like, and that helps our strategy and also our policy decision making.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. The sort of access to preview of roadmap is really helpful in saving us a lot of workload. So when I can't talk to specifics, but there are often things coming that we go, wow, like that just saved us, multiple years of development effort to building that into our application if Amazon is rolling it out in a quarter or two. The other thing that happened was, one of the areas we were looking into for FERPA compliance was how we do intrusion detection, and how do we monitor for intrusions in the cloud, especially at our scale. this is a tricky thing. And they provided some introductions to other ed tech vendors, to their CISOs, and we had conversations about, oh, how do you guys do this? Is often the approaches to these kinds of things in the cloud are more complicated than they are elsewhere, just because there's less history. It might in fact be an easier technical problem, but just less experience. So pooling experiences with other companies that are dealing with similar workloads is really valuable, and they provided those intros.
Ideally, I would have loved to employ professional services. That also depends on the speed at which you want to move. So if you're finding both a policy and resource growth together, I think it took us a little bit more. And so, but we really rely heavily on our account technical support, and we were provided with a lot of help really at no cost, which was great. And that kind of helped us make the journey, a little bit less painful, I would say. Now, with that, I'd say there were some issues that we ran into. That's normal. Well, part of the testing and evaluation process going through is you realize that in your software development team, which is anybody who develop code in their life, they know you would like to take shortcuts. So the shortcuts that work on your network. So if I have a 1 gig to the desktop and fiber network, but everything is fantastic, going great. But when you go to the cloud, things also slam the brakes. Like, what happened? And it's very easy for the developer. It's Amazon, right? I say, no. It's work with somebody else. Let's see what has gone wrong or what's different. They start looking at best practices, and you start really finding a lot of shortcuts that your environment, your development team has done over time. You go through that, it's time to clean up. And once you clean up, all of a sudden things will go back to normal. So yes, leveraging additional resources would have been very helpful, and it would have made it less painful in some instances. But also, sometimes you have to go through the growing pains, as an organization, as a group, to learn and improve your practices. But yeah, I would have loved to if I could afford it.
So for the folks in the audience that don't know, if you do have an account with Amazon right now, you may or may not know it if you're operating sort of independently. You actually do have an account manager that's associated with your account that you can reach out to, that can help plug you into to get those resources around solutions architecture, which, as we sort of pointed out, are a free resource.
If I may add, since I got an opportunity, the one thing I'd like to complain about, since we're using GovCloud, not that I'm a complainer, but is a lot of time you may look at things and, oh, this is great, this is exciting, I want to use this. You go like, oh, you want GovCloud? No, can have it. Oh, you want it? No, you can have it. So that thing, I hope we get to a point where there's more synergy between the commercial and GovCloud, so that way, we pay the bills too, so hopefully we get equal access.
Sure. So what he's referring to is that not all services are immediately available in GovCloud, and sometimes that can be a point of concern for some customers. But what we see increasingly moving forward is that as more service teams are starting to come online, they're increasingly looking at adding those services initially to GovCloud. And frequently that's our role in the public sector to encourage those service teams to please keep in mind that the GovCloud has some significant workloads.
Not all services are created equal, right?
There you go. So I want to go back to something that I think you said earlier that sort of drew a chord with me, and around automation. So all the buzz these days, especially in the Valley, is around this sort of DevOps culture, right? So embracing these principles of being lean and automation and workflow. Have any of your organizations, as part of the actual compliance package, integrated DevOps or DevSecOps as part of a process to meet that bar for your compliance regime?
Personally, yes. Basically, this is why when I was standing earlier and talking, I just really recommend, at least if you're in the HIPAA space, probably there's two, maybe you even have to for your standard BOSM, I don't know, the FedRAMP system security plan, something like that. Even if you don't have to do it, still check it out. Like, get on NIST, look at the pubs. It might be boring for a while. Eventually you'll get into it. It can teach you a lot, and you can learn a lot about how to basically strategize and make these decisions more clear, and include in that. So I'm technical myself as well as managerial, but if you're not technical, include someone who is, because you absolutely can fold those things into your, so for example, with us, how do you do source control, right? Bringing things from some like typical, old school Subversion standard to, Git with unit testing, in that environment, right? Those things are completely possible. And yeah, we're expanding them now.
Yeah, so we've definitely subscribed to the whole DevOps model, and we built a whole tool chain on top of that. If you're interested, you can read about it. It's called Empire, and it sits on top of Amazon's ECS, which is their container service. So we run all of our applications in Docker containers in ECS, and you use Empire as a tool to communicate. So the developers can make changes in production, but everything goes through that tooling, and everything's audited and stored. So we can search for anomalies there. No changes ever get made in production by a human directly. Like there are only a handful of people in our organization that can SSH into the cloud, and it's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to get there. By creating all that automation and all that auditing, we have really great practices that kind of help make us more compliant. Rather than less. It's not that you can't have all those processes out, in data centers on your own servers. Of course you can, but this allows us to sort of balance between being able to move fast as a startup and be able to monitor security requirements and work towards our regulatory requirements as well.
And for us, DevOps was actually part of the practice, when we were local. So the methodology, if you will, for DevOps and the iterative life cycle and the version control and change management and et cetera, all these things were part of the development life cycle for our software engineering practice. And, and having CJIS compliance be basically an umbrella. So we were practicing basic things that even when you log in, at any apps, or even just log into the desktop, you have certain, messages that come up, you will comply, blah, blah, blah. If not, thou shalt take your children, et cetera, right? Compliance. And that was a joke, by the way. So in case somebody want to quote me. Yeah, basically be violating law, et cetera, what have you. And also, the whole idea of auditing and change control and managing any changes and, background checking and fingerprinting and all of these things apply to everyone. Even if a contractor, if I hire a contractor to come in, hey, you're my DevOps guru, come in. Well, I got to wait about 40 days to do fingerprint, to background check you, but that slows things down. So if I have an urgency, you got to accept the fact that it ain't gonna happen. There's a process, so you got to go through that. And what we're looking forward right now, as we go through the last part of certification, is actually look at container buckets and what have you, et cetera, to implement those technologies to give us more flexibility, if you would, and more forward thinking capabilities.
Okay. So I want to ask a couple really quick questions based on each of your specific verticals. And Jason, I want to start with you. You brought up your Empire tool, which, again, if folks haven't heard about this, strongly encourage you to go check it out. It was an amazing tool, and no less, they gave it away to the community for free, which was super awesome. So thank you very much. Can you talk a little bit about your strategies for leveraging automation and that disposable architecture that you're referencing as part of your security overall practice?
Sure. One thing you can think about with a disposable architecture is we could, we're not doing this yet, but we certainly have the capability of doing it. Is we could be terminating hosts in our cluster all the time. Like we could terminate all of the host, every host once an hour. So it makes it a lot harder to attack from the outside or to gain access because everything's a moving target. Things are going away all the time. And when one of those hosts come down, auto-scaling just brings up another one to replace it. And then ECS redistributes the applications that were running in containers on that host onto other containers on other hosts. The same thing applies across availability zones. If we lost an entire availability zone, I'm sure that will never happen ever again. But if we lost an availability zone, ECS would again do the same thing and redistribute all of the containers, all the applications that were running in that one onto other AZs. And this, this both helps us from a scaling and resilience perspective, but it also helps us on the regulation side. We also do things where we detect package, so say security updates to the operating system or the AMI images, and those automatically get pulled in, and new images get built. And then we have the ability to push those out automatically as well, again, without involving developers or ops people to make that happen manually. And it again means that the amount of time that passes between when a critical security patch has been issued to when we can get it into production is smaller, and therefore less opportunity to have a compromise.
So Scotty, in HIPAA, patient care information is so critical, as well as trust. Can you talk about any of the methods that you're using around the AWS platform for audit and monitoring of your resources to give you that visibility, and if you're doing anything to automate response?
Sure. Yes. Essentially, in short, custom help desk tooling, not Empire, although that would be cool. Bunch of custom Python. Trying to think of useful things since there's so short time. Similar to the disposable architecture, actually client-side focus as well. So building a tool chain not for the servers and their package management, but actually for the client machines and their package management. So for example, people in Baylor who are using Windows machines, right? Being able to redeploy those by putting in a disk that actually pulls an image from something on the cloud where both ends of that connection have been verified, like with a baked-in trust certificate chain for those who are technical in the group. That way, you're basically getting a fresh Windows machine if there's a doctor who needs a new box and for some reason their machine's having an issue. So there are things like that. Also, since we're a little low on time now, I'd say CloudTrail. It's a lot of raw data, but you can basically turn on the ability to monitor all of your API calls to Amazon, and then once again with your own technical team, build out a custom solution to achieve your auditing goals.
So in the spirit of time, I want to encourage everyone to please come up and speak with our panelists. But before we adjourn, I wanted to pose the question that I suppose many in the audience have. For each of your verticals, I'm very sure that there are still naysayers among your peers. What would you say is sort of the elevator pitch for why cloud is a stronger position to be for your compliance regime?
Well, basically, if somebody has a question on basically the issue of security, I would just say, is it good enough for your money? Is it good enough for the FBI? Is it good enough for the CIA? Thank you very much. It's good for me.
Yeah, I think that cloud can be comparably secure to running in your own data centers. I think that there are different challenges, but then there are other things that are better, and it allows us to move more quickly, and it allows us to take advantage of a lot of other companies that are working in this field. So I think over time, this question of which is better will go away. I think in another 5-10 years, there'll be everyone will go, yes, it's just as good.
Scott?
I think I'd say that a lot of people say, the naysayers would say, it's a functionality versus security sort of mindset, and you truly can't have both. You can have functionality and security. You need to basically, pick a framework that actually helps you out in terms of whatever your business is. So again, FedRAMP, et cetera, even if it doesn't completely map onto your business objective, and follow through on it. Basically, I would say, the sort of more rough answer is prove it. Basically prove that the on-campus model, or whatever you want to call it, is actually still equivalently secure, because I've toured other data centers, and it also really depends on your provider. What Amazon is doing, some other provider, is most likely not going to be able to do, in terms of the physical operational security. So once you've chosen that, if you think that provider such as Amazon is right for you, then again with the framework in mind, like FedRAMP or whatever, being able to actually rely on your own operational skill set is critical. So make sure everyone has enough training, and like you were saying before, make sure your automated frameworks are the right calls. So yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you. If you have questions, please come up and ask.
Thank you, sir.
Very much.